Well, hello, everybody. This is Daniel Johnson, MD. I'm back at home here in Asheville, North Carolina. But what I'm sharing with you today is another episode of the podcast. This one's called New Delhi Early Reflections. And the purpose of this episode is to share my raw early impressions of what my experience to India was like and meant for me before I was coming home. Brooke and I had wrapped up our trip with the Inside India 2016 group, and we had 36 hours of a layover in New Delhi. And at this point, we were just exhausted and decided that we were going to handle our layover entirely at the Holiday Inn in New Delhi, which happened to be a great choice because it's a wonderful hotel. And it's not a bad place at all to be stranded. The reason we made this choice is because the air pollution in New Delhi is severe. It's the worst in the world. And at this point in the trip, I was coughing, wasn't feeling my best, was definitely exhausted from the trip, and just felt like I needed to rest in preparation for the long journey home. And Dr. Indu Arora, the trip leader of our group, who's going to be the guest on next week's episode of the podcast, and I really look forward to sharing that with you. She and I had a conversation right before we checked into the hotel, and she said, this layover isn't going to be an accident, it's going to serve a purpose. And those proved to be wise words because I was able to find a book in the bookstore of the Holiday Inn, and the book is by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is a very famous physician here in America. And he is most famous for his book, Cancer, the Emperor of All Maladies, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. And the book that I found was his book called The Laws of Medicine, which were laws that he observed and came up with based on his own observations and his own experience. So you could make a case in one sense that this was his own version of his anecdotal evidence. And those three laws are as follows. Law 1, a strong intuition is much more powerful than a weak test. Law 2, normals teach us rules, outliers teach us laws. And law 3, for every perfect medical experiment, there is a perfect human bias. And it's a short book. It's a brief book, so I would recommend it to anyone interested in health and understanding health better, especially from the perspective of medicine. And I certainly found these to be a great observational framework from which to comment on the experience of medicine. And so that's what I did as I reflected on my trip to India through the lens of having freshly read this book, The Laws of Medicine, while exhausted in New Delhi, with the eye on how this experience is going to shape my growth and my practice when I return back home to America. So, thanks for checking out this episode. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you find it useful in your own experience and your own journey. So without further ado, this is New Delhi Early Reflections. Well, hello everyone. This is Daniel Johnson, MD. I'm recording a podcast here from my hotel room in New Delhi, India. I'm at the New Delhi Airport Holiday Inn, which I have to say is the nicest Holiday Inn I've ever stayed in. It's quite luxurious, which was a welcome surprise. I'm wrapping up here a 2-week trip to northern India. The name of the trip was called Inside India, and our group consisted of 19 travelers and 3 guides. Our leader is Dr. Indu Arora, and she had 2 assistants with her, Agota and Gogo, and these 3 women were our fearless leaders, leading us 19 voyagers, seekers, and pathfinders on a 2-week survey of northern India. I recorded a couple of segments earlier in the journey. Dispatch from Rishikesh and quick check-in from Vrindavan. And I talk about some of the specifics of the trip in those segments, and feel free to check those out. I'm going to try to get those posted as well. But this one I'm titling this one Early Reflections, because the trip is about over. I'm going to board a flight home in about 8 hours for about 24 hours of travel getting home before heading back to work. But before I did, I wanted to reflect on this trip as best I could. As I mentioned, I'm staring out the window of this Holiday Inn. The sun's going down here in New Delhi, and I'm staring into the immense air pollution here, which is heartbreaking. It is unhealthy. It is ugly. It's pervasive. You smell it everywhere. I've been in this hotel room for about 30 hours straight now, and I'm going to be for the entire remainder of my duration here because the air is just unbreathable. I've gotten a little sick from the air, so I may be coughing and sniffling during the course of this, and hopefully I'll get this cleaned up as best as possible. But it's one of the occupational hazards of journeying to India. I wasn't the only one in our group. About half our group has had respiratory problems from the air pollution. It was just one of the ways that I didn't properly prepare myself for the difficulties of India. I didn't realize that the air pollution here in northern India is the worst in the world. I'm actually in the epicenter of air pollution. New Delhi has the worst air pollution of anywhere on earth, and you certainly can feel it and smell it. The smell of burning coal manages to infiltrate everywhere, even a well-insulated facility like this Holiday Inn. You can't get away from it, and it has to be dealt with. But this isn't just a complaint about the pollution. It's just one of the aspects that you deal with when coming to India. And I learned that through this experience. And there's been so much to this journey that has been experiential, meaning it's hard to put into words because the quality of the interaction, how it affects you, how it's affected me, is something that is very difficult to encapsulate, and yet I'm going to do the best I can. And so again, I'm calling this episode Early Reflections because, again, I'm going to be learning these lessons from India for days, weeks, months, years to come. This is perhaps the journey of my lifetime. Maybe the last time I ever come to India. And it's been quite an epic trip, and one that I am extremely grateful for despite the hardships. As I mentioned, I did get a little sick and had to deal with the 9 emotions, the 9 rasas, the 9 qualities of emotion as described by yoga, and I went through those in the episode from Vrindavan. But you have to deal with all the full spectrum of emotions in India, and what the science of yoga teaches us is that our obligation to ourselves in our pursuit of emotional equanimity, of tranquility, enlightenment, words that again are probably beyond encapsulation. In our pursuit of this higher state of being, we have to deal with these emotions and get beyond them. And that's an apt metaphor for the heart of the practice of psychiatry, helping us to cope with our mental state, our mental health, which is thrown off when our emotions are out of balance and our thoughts can become distorted in that context, and our actions can reflect that. And of course, it's my deep hope that this trip is going to inform me in my work as a psychiatrist. I really have been thinking about this nonstop, kind of day in, day out, what all this means, and it's just a lot of thoughts to organize and process. And as Dr. Indu was telling me before we parted ways yesterday, it's about the experience. This trip was called Insight India because the experience is what is going to help me develop a greater sense of insight into my own life and my own practice and what all of this means. Again, I'm watching the sun go down here in New Delhi. Can't actually see the sun. It's on the other side of the hotel, but I'm looking out into the thick haze. One of my fellow travelers, Deb from Boston, she looked up the weather, and every day the forecast was either hazy or smoke. So this is a real phenomenon. This is a real problem, pollution and human impact on the earth. And I've felt it like I've never felt it before. But I wanted to touch on some of the themes of this trip. The song The Seeker by The Who has been running through my head nonstop because I've felt like a seeker on this journey. And in the song, Roger Daltrey sings about how the Beatles and Timothy Leary and other folks, they didn't help him in his search. And I wouldn't say that India hasn't helped me on my search, but I think it's safe to say that it raises more questions than it provides answers. Because one of the themes that led me to India was that the hope was that the ancient science of yoga and Ayurveda, which developed here thousands of years ago, would help me on my journey inwards to discover myself and to help others discover more about themselves, to continue to peel away that onion, to use that metaphor, layer by layer, as we get closer and closer to our true, authentic nature. Some of the other themes that I want to talk about along with the journey inwards is the notion of healing. I've been reading a lot of stories here as I've been checking in on the web for updates from my Google News feed and from my Flipboard feed, and there's a lot of talk about where healing comes from, what is going to make us healthier, and I want to explore the notion of the material world versus the energetic world and what that means for the art of healing. I also hope that this trip is going to help me understand the layers of consciousness deeper, the koshas as they're described in Ayurveda. And hopefully that some of those lessons will emerge over time as I digest this trip. Again, as I mentioned, Dr. Indu was emphasizing the value of the experience, but also the value of proper digestion of this experience. The metaphor she gave me right before we parted ways was, you can eat a great meal, a most delicious meal, but if you don't digest it, what value is it? So digestion and processing of this experience is going to be a part of my life in the time to come, and I hope it informs me better in my work as well as in my personal journey. Another one of the themes that you can't help but pick up on in India is the notion of time. You see folks. Well, right now I'm staring out across at the few fancy hotels here, the Ibis Hotel, World Marks Hotel. I'm here in this fancy Holiday Inn hotel, which is quite futuristic. And so India is reaching towards the future. It's got one foot planted in the future, but it also spans thousands of years of time and human development as well, and you can see that in plain sight when you drive through the country and see folks farming the land by hand, cutting the grass with a machete, hauling fruits and vegetables in a man-pulled rickshaw. Life as it was thousands of years ago seemingly changed just the slightest bit until you see somebody standing in a field on the cell phone. And there's that juxtaposition of the ancient and the futuristic that you get here in India. Perhaps like a few other places on earth, and it is mind-blowing to experience it all. And it really calls to attention the need for adaptation and evolution. Because the problems that you see here in India are immense. There is trash everywhere. There is human waste everywhere, animal waste everywhere. There is sewage. There is disgust at seeing all this, and this is a huge problem. And India is figuring out how it's going to evolve through it. But you get also the sense that the human connection of all this is immense, you can't separate it. In other words, India's problems are our problems. This isn't something that the people of India have done in a bubble. These problems come about from exploitation, which we in the West have exploited India for hundreds of years, since the British, and even before that when the Mughals came and conquered. And you see, I saw firsthand human exploitation in the Taj Mahal, which was built by slave labor in the ultimate vanity project, but which ended up creating one of the wonders of the world, and it is incredible to look at. It is quite an achievement. So there's just immense contradictions and juxtapositions of these contradictions that you can't help but just feel these emotions very deeply. And at times it's overwhelming. I've definitely cried more in the past 2 weeks than I have in a long time. I felt the tears at the surface, welling up real quickly. It's been an emotional outpouring. But as I was saying, the problems of India are problems that we all share globally, worldwide. We're all connected to these problems, and we have an obligation to do our part to help solve them, which brings about notions of the ancient, simple Indian system of karma, cause and effect, which reminds me of the karma of my own life. How the good things we do bring about good things, and the bad things we do bring about bad things. And for every cause, there is an effect, and for every effect, there was a previous cause, and how the chain of karma cannot be broken, despite our attempts at doing that. And so definitely I've been exploring myself and my life here, 42 years old, what it's meant up to this point and what it's meaning going forward. And that connection of karma is also felt in the human connection of the oral tradition, which is what the ancient system of yoga comes from. It comes from the oral tradition. Again, it goes back thousands of years, and it wasn't until the great Patanjali wrote it in his Yoga Sutras, wrote it out, that we had a print version of it. But we were able to have the good fortune of watching this awesome documentary on the history of yoga, which is, in many senses, the history of human evolution. And one of the themes that has just been resonating deeply is that this system of yoga, in that it goes back thousands of years, it goes back to the Harappan civilization, ancient civilization, which was a matriarchal civilization, and existed peacefully for many generations, hundreds and thousands of years, before somehow there was a change in human history, and we moved on to a more patriarchal civilization, which has led us to this great imbalance that we're speaking now of, this imbalance in male energy, warfare, exploitation, etc. Our yin and yang are out of balance. And even the system of yoga was co-opted as an exclusively male system for a period of time. So these deep themes have been resonating with me throughout this trip. And as I've been thinking about these challenges that we're facing, they're all around. You can see it in plain sight here in India at any given location. It brings about the nature of the external versus the internal. Because when I look around on my phone, in my news feed, out here into the dense smog of New Delhi, or looking down through the window here into the trash-filled gutters, with debris everywhere, in a mess that has seemingly no end. It's quite disheartening. And reading about all these scientific studies that are popping up in my news feed that talk about these miracle cures for our human ailments, that I just have such skepticism towards the external. There's so much difficulty there, and yet we live in the world of the external. That's what our consciousness is an experience where our internal is interfacing with this external. And it's not all ugly. And internally, it's definitely not all beautiful. All these emotions that come up have all kinds of the full range of qualities, many of which are ugly. Ugly thoughts, fears, anxieties, disgusts, angers, etc. And yet, it reminds me that each of our primary obligations is to clean up our internal, to cultivate a consciousness of greater healing, of aiming towards the light. And, this trip is reminding me that each of these experiences is an opportunity to reflect on these emotions that come up and to learn how to work through them and how to learn the lessons from them. One of my last experiences here in India was picking up a book downstairs in the gift shop by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is a physician. He's about my age, but he's well accomplished, and he's done great things, and I have deep respect for him. The book is called The Laws of Medicine, and it's a quick read, which is an accompaniment to one of his TED Talks. But he's also known for his book on cancer, which I believe is called The Emperor of All Maladies. Won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. And it's a great little book, The Laws of Medicine. I encourage all physicians listening to this to read it. And in there he describes his 3 laws of medicine, which he reflected upon and developed during his residency from his immersive experience as a resident in Boston. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you right now. Just to summarize, his experience led him to 3 laws, which he says he uses with every patient, and I think it's a good meditation to reflect upon. The first law that he has outlined is that a strong intuition is much more powerful than a weak test. And that is an interesting law that he has been able to observe. And what he means by that is the ability for a physician to utilize his or her experience and previous observation is as much of a useful guide as any seemingly objective test, because all tests are flawed. And I was reflecting upon this as it applies to psychiatry. When I say all tests are flawed, all tests have false positives and false negatives, and there is no perfect test. And the art of medicine depends upon a physician's experience in guiding the patient to a healing path. And I'm glad to hear that he was able to recognize that this strong intuition is the crucial element and the most valuable element of medicine, because that's why I call this podcast Anecdotal Evidence, because the experience that I've accumulated in 10 years since residency has been very valuable to me. It's been immensely valuable, and that's the part that I want to share with my patients and clients, as I refer to them, because I think we can easily be misled by our misinterpretation of what is labeled as science, but is always going to be colored by the human flaws and is so often misinterpreted. So I did agree with him there, and I would encourage all of you to reflect upon your intuition for your healing path and using your intuition to help others, because that was another lesson that I picked up on in India here from one of the great teachers that we met, who was another Siddhartha. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. His name was Siddhartha Krishna, and he is the scholar in residence at the Om Karananda ashram in Rishikesh, which was the most beautiful place of our journey from my perspective. And I found his lectures deeply inspiring. I'm going to be in the process of contacting him and seeing if I can share his lectures with you. He has a YouTube channel where you can see his lectures on the Vedas, the ancient system of knowledge, the ancient texts of knowledge here in India. He has many YouTubes on that. He has a Twitter feed, which is actually quite good. I say that because I find most of Twitter to be intolerable noise, and his is a beacon of clarity, which I think we all need. And of course, things come in threes, and on this trip, we were fortunate enough to tour the grounds of where the Buddha himself gave his very first lecture in Varanasi. And the Buddha's name, of course, was Siddhartha Gautama. So these three Siddharthas were powerful teachers on this trip, and I'm going to be reflecting on these lessons for a long time to come. Very grateful for them. And, back to the law 1, how a strong intuition is more powerful than a weak test. It reminds me of the problems we face in psychiatry in our diagnostic system, where folks are given labels about their condition, their ailment, that places them in categories, in boxes that have absolutely no science behind them. These are just categories that people make up as they sit around a table at the American Psychiatric Association. And I wouldn't even call that a pseudoscience, because it's not even attempted to be rooted in science. But this categorization, this test, quote unquote, is not very useful. It's not nearly as useful as the patient's own intuition, the client's own intuition, and the doctor's intuition, and their connected intuition through the therapeutic relationship in finding that healing path. So I really appreciate Siddhartha Mukherjee's first law. And the second law is that normals teach us rules and outliers teach us laws. And by that, he was referring to, in the broader system of physical medicine, which does rely on physical diagnosis and does have science behind it. There are folks who fit into very classic diagnoses of diabetes mellitus type 1 or type 2, or congestive heart failure, or coronary artery disease, or broken fibula, or appendicitis, or uterine tumor, etc. And there are folks who fit very nicely into these categories. And then there are folks whose ailments push at the fringes of these categories, or even exist beyond our understanding. And so what Mukherjee was saying here, or my interpretation of it, is that these folks who fit nicely into these categories teach us some of the rules of medicine, but a law is more powerful than a rule, and the law includes the totality of human experience. And I think what he is saying is that this immensity requires a good physician to be open to outliers, to recognize that every individual is a potential outlier. And what a great metaphor for the field of psychiatry, where the term normal is, it's not only in a vague term, it's not only hard to pin down, it's impossible to pin down, and it's a term that really creates more harm than good and emphasizes that rules are made to be broken, but laws are there for exploration and for discovery. And I would encourage folks who have been struggling with mental and emotional issues and seeing psychiatrists and seeing therapists, or just struggling in their own way, to recognize that the pursuit of normal is of course a fruitless task, and that our real challenge is to take a curiosity to the parts of ourselves that are outliers, that are our quirks, that are sometimes characterized as flaws or characterized as great strengths, either which way, but to learn from these idiosyncrasies, because that's where our character lies, and that's where the lessons are to be learned. And that the pursuit of normal is, again, not only fruitless, but it's damaging, because we only have so much time and we're never going to get there. And it just reminds me of those who are struggling out there. You know, I hear every day about folks who are going into psychiatric hospitals, and I work with folks in acute settings who are struggling in immense ways. And in this experience, the struggle is not to be stamped or squashed. It's our teacher. And the third law that Siddhartha Mukherjee outlines from his experience is, for every perfect medical experiment, there's a perfect human bias. And I guess I've already spoken about this earlier with my frustration with what is passed off as science by the FDA when they approve certain drugs for mass distribution to the public. But I think it also brings to mind the notion of subjectivity. And again, that was a key thematic element for why I chose the name Anecdotal Evidence, because an anecdote is a subjective experience that's shared. And just as the scientific evidence can never be perfectly objective, that doesn't have to be a discouraging thing, because the subjective qualities within that is often where the nectar lies for our own growth. Because our point of view, our consciousness, our feelings and emotions are there for a reason. As the law of karma tells us, these are effects from a previous cause, and that's where our learning can be directed. The human bias isn't to be eliminated in psychiatry and mental health and emotional health. It's to be learned from. And that doesn't mean that our subjectivity is supreme, that our opinions are better than anyone else's, but those are our own personal little teachers that are always going to be there, and if we can come to peace with them and just listen to our own experience rather than trying to suppress it, then our likelihood of learning from that experience will improve, and we're more likely to find our particular healing path, and we're more likely to be able to share this with others. So thank you, Siddhartha Mukherjee, for writing this wonderful book, The Laws of Medicine. And in his little epilogue to the book, he emphasizes that these are just the 3 laws that he's observed. And there are many other laws which can be characterized in other ways. And it's up to us to discover our own laws out there and to share these. So I really appreciated that. But back to India, because here I am and the sun has now gone down. It's dark in India. April 3rd, 2016, which means that most of the listeners who are going to be listening to this are on the other side of the world where the sun is shining brightly. But here I am as the seeker, and my trip is winding down. I've seen the sunset for the last time here on India. Probably for the last time in my life. And in this early reflection, this experience has definitely raised more questions than it's provided me answers. I've learned only that the world is even bigger and more problematic than I could have even imagined. And these problems are real, and they're growing and they're expanding, and they threaten to overwhelm us unless each and every one of us gives our full attention to what our part is in this. And discerning what our part is requires immense clarity. And so this is a call to action to myself of the need for clarity. Because these problems of pollution and poverty, human waste, poor water quality, poor hygiene, destruction of the environment, destruction of ecosystems, even problems like on the human scale of religious exploitation and violence and abuse and all these things which are just as much in India as they are anywhere. Sometimes more so, sometimes less, but they're there. And yet, the more that I see of all this, the more that India has taught me that the practice of cleaning up the internal and doing the internal work is where the progress is going to lie. I had the great experience not only of meeting Siddhartha Krishna, as I mentioned, and Dr. Indu Arora. And these are 2 of the luminaries, the great teachers who I met on this trip, but there are 2 others who I may have mentioned in the other little dispatches, but they were known as Babaji and Masaji. And those are Indian names for father teacher and maybe mother teacher, I'm not sure exactly, but it was a beautiful experience to be able to meet 2 real wise elders. And that was the nectar and the essence of this trip for me, is meeting these great teachers. And Masaji, her name as the general public calls her, is Shashi Khosla. And she runs the Yoga Therapy Center in Pune, India. And that was Dr. Indu's personal teacher. And so, of course, Indu has the deepest admiration and love for her teacher. And it was just so inspiring seeing them together on this trip. Seeing that actual connection, human connection, the oral tradition of how the real yoga has been passed down for generations, centuries, millennia. And we got to experience some actual lessons, some lectures and yoga practices from Masaji herself. And The first class that we went to, I just broke down after the class because there was more in that hour class of real healing, real understanding than I experienced in years of study in various other disciplines. I don't want to talk badly of anything, but I mean, this was the pure and real nectar. Indu described her as having a PhD in common sense, because I don't think she has any formal letters behind her name, although this woman is a mountain of a teacher. And that was just an absolute highlight of this trip, as was our experience with Babaji, who is actually Siddhartha's father. And he is a wise elder living in Rishikesh, India, in the hills just beyond the town. And just to share this little story, we went on a brief tuk-tuk trip from our ashram in Rishikesh up to his home, where he and Siddhartha lived together in a very simple and modest abode. And we had an hour as a group where Babaji, who is up there in years, he looked like he was at least 80 years old, quite elderly, but strong in spirit and strong in mind. And despite the fact that he's blind, legally blind, he had his assistants helping him, and primarily that assistant is Siddhartha, his son, who led him into the room where we were able to sit at his feet. And he just listened to each one of us and took a moment to hear each of our names and to share a little story reflecting on the meaning of our names, and just a nice little bit of sharing and healing. And it was truly a magical experience because, as Dr. Indu shared, he is pure love. And you could feel it. I felt it. And I was thinking of the Grinch, how his heart busted out of his cage when he felt that pure love, and that was the sensation that welled up inside of me, just being in his presence and being able to share an hour with him. And he spent some time with each of us individually, and this last bit about Babaji was our schedule was behind schedule and getting there, and we spent more time with him than we were supposed to. And we were supposed to head from there to another ashram for a meditation. And we had to kind of rush off from Babaji's home. And he said he wanted to go with us, but, he could barely walk. And, we had to take a challenging tuk-tuk ride. And we were, we did our best at saying, "Oh, thank you, Babaji, but, we're going to have to say goodbye now." And we journeyed down to the ashram and we toured it, and we sat down for our meditation. We met, before we sat down for the meditation, at the end of our tour, we looked over, and here he is coming out of the car with Siddhartha, and they're walking across the field to join us for the meditation. And he was escorted up to the room where the leader of the ashram led us in an hour-long silent meditation, which was a powerful experience for me because I'd never meditated for that long. And afterwards, we had dinner and we went back to our ashram, and it wasn't until later that Dr. Indu shared with us that despite this place being, fairly close to where he lives, just about a half-hour tuk-tuk ride, he hadn't actually visited this other ashram in 15 years. and roughly 15 years. And he made it happen just to be there with us. And we don't know exactly why he chose this. Those reasons are only known to him, but he made that sacrifice, this difficult trip for this very old man in frail health, and I can't find the words to express the feeling of knowing that he made that trip for us, and the inspiration that I'm taking from that. So, overall, the main lesson that I'm taking from India is one that I think we can find anywhere. You definitely don't have to go to India to find this, which is that the human connection is what it's all about in this journey of the heart, which we're all on. And I'm so grateful for this experience. I'm going to be learning lessons from my trip to India for the rest of my life. So now that it's ending and winding down, I'm glad I had an opportunity to share these early reflections with you, the listeners of the podcast of Anecdotal Evidence. It's been a remarkable and truly amazing experience. So, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments about my trip to India or about my experience thus far, please don't hesitate. Send me an email. anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com is the email. And if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, all the same, drop me a line. Love to hear from you. I appreciate all the feedback thus far. I look forward to continuing the podcast with you. I'm going to share some of the recordings from this trip. I don't know what they sound like, but I'm going to share them as best I can. And from Siddhartha Krishna as well. I just have to get his permission to share them. Again, feel free to check these people out on the web. They would love to share with you because these folks are great teachers. And there's so much to learn out there. So again, thanks for tuning in. Signing off for now here in New Delhi, India. This is Daniel Johnson, MD. Take care.